Hello, my name is Andrew Omdahl, and today I'll be informing you about rotational grazing for cattle. I'm going to try to cover three main points: what rotational grazing is, the different types of rotational grazing, and how rotational grazing impacts land conservation. Rotational grazing, in fact, does impact land conservation and cattle management. For those of you that don't know what rotational grazing is, it is a tech or a grazing practice where you take your cattle and you lock them up in a pasture or whatever, and then you have different areas for the cattle to graze. So on our farm, we have three pastures that have rotational or that have cross fences in them where we practice rotational grazing. For the first half of the season, we have our cattle on one half of the cross fence, and as they graze this down, the other half rests and grows vegetation. So once they have all that vegetation on their half chewed down, we turn them across to the other half, and so that half can rest, and the other is where they graze. Um, After researching, I came to find out that there's not really many other types of rotational grazing. There's other grazing practices, but I just wanted to stay away from those so I could focus on rotational grazing. But the only way to have different types of rotational grazing is to uh, either put more cross fences in your pasture to have more areas for your cattle to graze. The more areas you have to graze, more the more of your pasture is resting. So, um, land conservation. This is probably the biggest point. Rotational grazing really influences uh, land conservation. Um, Woolfolk, he wrote in his research note in March 1960 that rotational grazing impacted land conservation in this way. There was a pasture that had been um, rested 3 full seasons and 3 half seasons before a drought, and uh, there's another pasture that hadn't been rested at all the 7 years before the drought. And during that season of the drought, the pasture that had been rested outproduced um, the pasture that had been continuously grazed, if you will. It produced more vegetation than that pasture, so that just goes to show how it promotes land conservation. Um, Undersander, Albert, Cosgrove, Johnson, and Peterson wrote in their book Pastures for Profit, A Guide to Rotational Grazing. They wrote in that book that land conservation is impacted by the vegetation that is always present during rotational grazing on your grassland. Um, the wind and the water erosion only takes zero point 0.1 tons per acre of soil from your grassland area. So that's a huge difference from croplands in Wisconsin that are losing 2.5 tons per acre of soil. So um, the other conservation point that I wanted to cover is wildlife. Rotational grazing, while the one half is resting and the cattle are on the other half of the pasture, that gives birds that nest in grasslands, that gives them that whole half of a pasture to make their nests and not be disturbed by the cattle or have grass to nest in. Whereas on the other half now, the cattle are over there eating that, and then once they go to the other half, the birds will probably move over to the new vegetation that has grown over there. So wildlife is definitely impacted by rotational grazing as well. Well, with that said, I hope I was able to teach you about rotational grazing, and I hope I will be able to learn something from your guys' speech too. Thanks.